Hello and welcome to the Occult book review. Sorry it's been a while since my last video review. I do still review books, mostly for magazines and websites. If you follow the Twitter page, you can keep up with the various reviews that I have been doing. This video review then is The Tree of Visions, Visionary Traditions of the Western World, Shamanism, Magic and Myth from Prehistory to the Present by David Nez. David is a writer, an art therapist and an occult scholar. So first of all, shamanism. Do we even still use that word? Specifically, shamanism refers to practice belonging to the Tungus people, but it should be specified that even within shamanism, in the Tungus and Asian regions, different shaman will have different titles depending on what they do. It's become, I suppose, handy for people to talk about their own indigenous spiritual practices, even here in Ireland, as being shamanistic. I don't think there's any malice, and I don't think there's appropriation in a really negative way here. I think it may be inaccurate, of course, but David does talk about this in a later chapter in the book. The Tree of Visions then is really a journey through all of our spiritual traditions, and I don't say that lightly, it really is. We begin in the Paleolithic, and some of the people the author talks about are Maria Gimbutas, David Lewis Williams. You might know he wrote The Mind in the Cave. I think at the time he had a bit of an argument with Graham Hancock, who said that how can you write a book about entheogens if you're not going to take them yourself? Lewis Williams is what's called a neuro-theologist. I think he believes that the idea of God is created in the mind anyway, and this can just happen when you take psychedelics. But so the author in this book, The Tree of Visions, shows how certain archetypes from the Paleolithic have made their way all the way through the various spiritual and magical traditions to today. Two most obvious ones, I suppose, are the horned god and the fertility goddess figure. The author talks about Maria Gimbutas in that respect. We follow the traditions then through Asia, through the various migrations of people up into Europe, over here to Ireland as well. The author takes a look at pre-Celtic ideas, and as well as that he talks about what happened when the Celts arrived as well. And it's interesting that Chris Bennett writes about that in his new book as well. And it's funny that up until recently, Irish archaeologists and anthropologists didn't really take the idea of a type of shamanism in that way that might include entheogens very seriously. But evidence now shows that cannabis certainly played a large part with Celtic shamanism, just to use that word again. We have evidence of hemp seeds at burials. We found inside various what are called tombs. I don't believe that they are tombs. We found traces of cannabis resin and other burnt substances. So some of these places certainly seem to be locations where people went on these sensory deprivation journeys. So the author talks about that as well, and he goes on to speak about some of my own favourite writers, people like Peter Kingsley, who wrote about sensory deprivation as well, and the whole Asclepius type sect where people would experience healing by being brought down into a dark cave sometimes, and they would basically be put into a deep sleep and they would access the other world that way. Of course, as the author writes about, what is the other world anyway? Well, all the different various cultural, as Dr. Jeffrey Kripal would say, the cultural transforms end up giving each indigenous interpretation its own identity, and what that sometimes does is it makes it look like we're all accessing different places, but I would be of the opinion that we're all accessing the same place. It's just that it's so vast, and who's to say that if you access the other world now, you're accessing the same terrain, if you want to use that description, as someone 1,000 years ago, because I believe like here on Earth, cycles come and go. Planets have orbits. Who's to say that the other world might not also have its own tides and its own turnings and cycles? So what was accessed and what came through spiritually 2,000 years ago may not be the same things that are coming through now. You notice that as the author goes on throughout the book, he talks about all the way up through to the grimoire tradition and the different identities and names. He talks about Solomonic magic. He talks about the grimoire traditions, as I mentioned. Then he talks about all our various ways of describing this, and it goes from myths and folklore. He talks about then of Jung, of course, as well, and the way we are quick to put archetypal identities on things that we don't really understand. He talks about neo-paganism, synchronicity. He talks about all the magical systems that people use. So it's a very interesting book for me. As you can see, I've gone through it a couple of times already, and it's one that I think I will be going back to again. It's worth mentioning, like the author, as I said at the start, he brings everything up to date. So he talks about all the different scientific explanations that have been put forward for these phenomena. So I would say that this is a very, very valuable overview of the history of spiritual traditions in all of their manifestations. I'd highly recommend the book then, The Tree of Visions, Visionary Traditions of the Western World, Shamanism, Magic and Myth, from Prehistory to the Present, and it's by David Nez. Okay, so hopefully see you again soon for another occult book review. Thanks.